The very first time the knock echoed through the quiet expanse of my hallway, I genuinely did not think anything of it. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday evening in early autumn, one of those liminal, in-between days where the atmosphere still clung desperately to the lingering warmth of summer, yet the golden light outside surrendered to a soft, bruised dusk far too early. The shadows were lengthening across the hardwood floors, stretching like reaching fingers through the blinds. I was sitting at my kitchen island, with my laptop glowing brightly against the dimming room, half focused on the marketing copy I was supposed to be finalizing, half scrolling mindlessly through social media feeds. In my hand I was nursing a large glass of an expensive red wine I probably did not need to open, but which I had poured anyway just to give my hand something to do. My husband Julian was gone on yet another extended business trip. This time he was in Seattle, or perhaps it was Denver. I had honestly stopped keeping track of his itineraries, because after a certain point, all of his absences simply blurred together into one long continuous stretch of empty space in our home. The house always felt too large when he was away, echoing with a profound silence that settled into the corners of every room. The knock came again. It was a little louder this time. It was not an aggressive sound, but it carried a steady persistence that forced me to pull my attention away from the glowing screen. I distinctly remember feeling a fleeting wave of annoyance wash over me. In this day and age, who actually shows up at someone's front door completely unannounced? People texted. People called. They did not just stand on porches waiting for a face-to-face interaction. I took a slow sip of my wine, set the glass down on the marble counter, and made my way to the entryway. When I pulled the heavy oak door open, I saw him standing there under the warm glow of the porch light. It was Ethan, the son of the woman who lived in the house next to ours. He looked significantly smaller than I remembered, even though I had passively watched him grow up, over the past handful of years, from across the lawn. He was probably 14 now, maybe freshly 15. He possessed that lanky, awkwardly proportioned frame so common to teenage boys, standing there as if his rapidly growing limbs did not quite belong to him yet, and he had no idea what to do with his hands. He had a frayed canvas backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder, and his face wore a deeply hesitant, almost pained expression. It was the look of someone who was already mentally apologizing for taking up your time before a single word had even left his mouth. He shifted his weight from one worn sneaker to the other. "Hey, Chloe," he said, his voice carrying that slight, unpredictable crack of adolescence. I am really sorry to bother you. My mom said you are good at, writing stuff." I blinked at him, completely caught off guard by the request. The cool evening breeze drifted through the open doorway, carrying the scent of dried leaves and distant wood smoke. "Writing stuff?" I repeated, trying to process the situation. "Yeah, like essays and papers. I have this big assignment for school, and I really do not get it at all. She said you might be able to help me." His mother, Valerie, and I were not exactly what anyone would call close friends. We fell firmly into the category of friendly neighbors. We would exchange pleasant waves across the driveway, while carrying groceries, make polite small talk at the cluster of neighborhood mailboxes, and occasionally chat about the weather when we both happened to be dragging our trash bins out to the curb on Thursday mornings. During one of those brief, superficial conversations, she had asked what I did for a living, and I had mentioned that I worked in corporate marketing, specifically writing brand content and copy. I suppose in her mind a professional copywriter seamlessly translated into a free neighborhood tutor for high school English homework. I hesitated. It was only for half a second, but I felt the distinct pull of my quiet, uninterrupted evening, urging me to politely decline. I could have easily said I was too busy with my own work, but looking at him standing there, looking so entirely lost and hopeful, I simply could not turn him away. I stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Yeah, sure," I said, keeping my tone warm and welcoming. "Come on in." That was it. That was precisely how the entire situation started. There was absolutely nothing dramatic about that moment. There was nothing suspicious or alarming. It was just a neighborhood kid needing a little bit of guidance with a school paper. He walked into the house with hesitant, quiet steps, as if he were afraid of breaking something. He settled onto one of the tall stools at my kitchen island, while I leaned comfortably against the counter opposite him, taking his crumbled assignment sheet and reading over the printed instructions. It was a deeply personal narrative essay. The prompt asked the students to describe a specific moment that fundamentally changed the way they viewed the world around them. It was a perfectly standard creative writing exercise, exactly the kind of emotional, reflective piece I could map out and write in my sleep. I slid the paper back across the smooth marble surface toward him. "So what exactly is confusing you about this?" I asked gently. He shrugged his shoulders, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the grain of the countertop, actively avoiding any direct eye contact. "I just do not know what to write about." I smiled a little, hoping to put him at ease. "Well, finding the topic is kind of the whole point of the assignment I offered." "Yeah, I know," he replied, his voice dropping slightly. "But I really haven't had, like, a big movie moment like that. Nothing crazy has ever happened to me." I studied his face for a long second. He seemed completely sincere. He was not being lazy, and he was not trying to manipulate me into doing the work for him, so he could go play video games. He was genuinely stuck, paralyzed by the pressure of trying to find something profound in a life he probably viewed as entirely mundane. "Everyone has experienced something that shifted their perspective," I said, keeping my voice soft and encouraging. "It absolutely does not have to be some massive, dramatic event. It just needs to be a quiet moment that made you think differently, a realization, a change in the weather of your mind." He nodded slowly, processing my words. But I could clearly tell the concept was still entirely out of his grasp. The blank page in front of him remained an insurmountable obstacle. So I decided to take a different approach. I simply started asking him questions. I asked about his daily routine at school, his friend group, the teachers he liked and disliked. I asked about his family life. I was just throwing out conversation starters, hoping to strike a nerve or spark a hidden memory. At first, his answers were incredibly brief. He gave me short, one-word responses, non-committal shrugs, and the standard, impenetrable emotional wall that teenagers instinctively build around themselves. But after a few minutes of patient, gentle probing, I felt something in the air shift. He started opening up. It was just a crack at first, a slight loosening of his posture. He began talking about how his parents had been fighting constantly over the past few years. He talked about how the arguments used to be loud, and then they turned into a terrifying, suffocating silence. He told me about how his father had finally moved out late last year, packing his bags on a rainy Saturday morning. He described how strange and hollow his house felt now, like all the furniture had been rearranged in the dark, and nothing really fit in its proper place anymore. I had not expected that level of raw vulnerability. When I opened the door, I honestly thought I would be helping him correct dangling modifiers and organize sentence structures. I did not expect to be sitting in my kitchen navigating the heavy emotional wreckage of a broken family. "That sounds exactly like the kind of moment your teacher is looking for," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, laced with genuine empathy. "That kind of profound change in your home, it permanently affects how you see everything else in your life." He looked down at his hands, tracing a small scratch on the counter with his thumb. "Yeah," he murmured softly, "I guess it does." We ended up spending well over an hour working through the tangled web of his thoughts. I patiently helped him outline his chaotic feelings, drawing them out of his head and arranging them onto the paper. I showed him how to translate raw, complicated grief into structured sentences that actually made sense and carried emotional weight. He wrote very slowly, his pen scratching carefully across the notebook paper, acting as if every single word carried an immense, fragile importance. When he finally finished the last paragraph and began packing his supplies back into his frayed backpack, he physically looked different. His shoulders were lower, the tension in his jaw had evaporated. He looked lighter, as if he had literally poured some of his internal burden out onto the pages he was now zipping away. "Thank you," he said, standing awkwardly near the front door, shifting his weight again. "I really didn't think I would actually be able to finish it." "You did all the heavy lifting," I told him, offering a warm smile. "You found the words, I just helped you organize them a little bit." He gave me this incredibly small, almost imperceptibly shy smile, nodded once, and then walked out into the cool night. I locked the door behind him, cleaned up my wine glass, and honestly did not think much about the interaction after that. It was a good deed done for a neighbor. But then he came back. It was only 2 days later. I heard the exact same hesitant, gentle knock against the wood. I opened the door to find the exact same awkward, lanky stance on my front step. "Hey," he said, looking at his shoes before meeting my eyes. I got another assignment today. It isn't a writing paper this time. It is history, but I still really don't get the material." A rational voice in the back of my mind whispered that I should have said no. I should have politely explained that I was busy, or suggested that he speak to his teacher, or at the very least, told him to come back another time. I am a busy professional, not a drop in tutoring center. But I didn't say no. "Come on in," I said again, stepping aside and letting the cool autumn air into the hallway alongside him. That isolated incident quickly morphed into a steady, reliable pattern. At first, his visits were restricted to maybe once a week. Then, it slowly crept up to twice a week. Sometimes he genuinely needed academic assistance, navigating a difficult math concept, or breaking down a dense reading assignment. Other times, however, it became glaringly obvious that he was not coming over for educational support. It felt increasingly clear that he simply did not want to walk into his own empty, echoing house right away. And I never pushed him away. If I am being entirely honest with myself, I gradually started to look forward to the sound of his knock. Saying that out loud sounds significantly worse than the reality of the situation actually was. At the very least, it was not what a cynical observer might immediately jump to assume. There was nothing inappropriate happening. Not in those early weeks, it served as a much-needed distraction from my own reality. My own house had been suffocatingly quiet for a very long time. It was too quiet. Julian and I rarely ever fought anymore. In a twisted, desperate way, actual screaming arguments would have almost been preferable to the current state of our marriage. Fighting, yelling, throwing things, those actions at least indicated that something within the relationship was still breathing. It meant there was still passion, even if it was negative. Instead, we simply coexisted. We drifted past each other in the hallways like polite, exhausted ghosts haunting the same property. He traveled constantly for his firm, and on the rare occasions when he was physically present in the house, he was entirely mentally absent. He was either glued to his glowing phone screen answering relentless emails, or he was so deeply fatigued that he simply collapsed onto the sofa. Trying to hold a meaningful conversation with him felt like a tedious obligation for both of us. We had not truly connected, emotionally or otherwise, in months. So having another human being willingly sit across from me at the kitchen island, actively asking me questions, looking at me, and actually listening to the words I was saying, it filled an expansive, echoing void in my daily life that I hadn't even consciously realized was so devastatingly empty. As the weeks bled into one another, Ethan started talking more, too. The conversations expanded far beyond the rigid boundaries of schoolwork and teacher complaints. He started talking about the intricate dynamics of his life. He told me about his friends, about the kids in his class who drove him crazy, about his anxieties regarding the future. Sometimes, he would carefully steer the conversation toward his mother. He was always incredibly cautious when speaking about her, measuring his words as if navigating a minefield. I could always tell there were heavy, unspoken truths lingering just beneath the surface of his stories. You know, you never have to tell me anything. You are not completely comfortable sharing, I told him gently one evening while he was staring blankly at a geometry text. He nodded slowly, absorbing the reassurance. But then, after a long pause, he looked up. "It is just that she is so different now," he murmured. "Different in what way?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. He let out a heavy sigh and shrugged. "I don't know exactly. She is just always so tired. Or she is incredibly angry. Or sometimes she is just both at the exact same time." Those words hit me with a sharp, unexpected physical ache. They landed a little too close to my own home, a little too close to the reflection I actively avoided in my own mirror. I did not like the feeling of being mirrored by the unhappy mother of a teenager. Because of that discomfort, I made a conscious effort to keep our interactions light and breezy. After that evening, I steered our discussions strictly toward the safe, structured world of his homework and benign pop culture topics. But the invisible boundary line between us had already shifted. It was a microscopic movement, barely perceptible, but it was there. One evening, as November began to strip the trees bare, he stayed significantly later than his usual departure time. I had been reading a magazine on the sofa while he sat on the rug, supposedly reviewing flashcards. The room had grown completely dark outside the large bay windows, and when I casually glanced over at the digital clock on the mantel, a small jolt of surprise went through me. It was well past 8 o'clock. "Does your mom know you are still over here?" I asked, suddenly feeling a sudden rush of responsibility. "Yeah," he replied, entirely too quickly. "I texted her. I told her I was here." Something subtle in the pitch of his voice, a slight tremor of hesitation, made me pause. My instincts told me he was lying, or at least omitting the full truth, but I chose to let it slide. "You should probably pack up and head back," I said, setting my magazine down on the coffee table. "It is getting pretty late for a school night." He did not jump up and start gathering his things right away. Instead, he just sat there on the rug, his fingers nervously fidgeting with the frayed nylon strap of his backpack. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice unusually quiet, almost fragile. "Sure," I replied, sitting up a little straighter, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. He hesitated again, chewing on his lower lip, as if he were having a fierce internal debate about whether or not to voice the thought in his head. "Do you ever feel like the adults around you just spend all their time pretending everything is perfectly fine when it is incredibly obvious that it isn't?" I let out a soft, breathy laugh, completely unprepared for the emotional depth of the question. It felt as though he was trying to read a secret language hidden just beneath the surface of my skin. "My mom does that all the time," he continued, his voice steadying. "It is like she puts on this mask and acts like we are totally okay. Like nothing happened. But we are not okay. We haven't been okay in a long time." I sat back against the cushions, completely at a loss for words. There are certain fragile moments in life where you realize that any single thing you choose to say will inevitably feel like the absolute wrong thing. So I offered the only thing I could. I simply nodded. "That is incredibly hard to deal with," I said softly. He nodded in agreement, but the serious, intense expression on his youthful face did not waver or soften. If anything, his gaze grew sharper, more focused. "And you," he added, his voice dropping an octave. My stomach instantly tightened into a hard, cold knot. What about me? He held my gaze across the dim room, for a second entirely too long for comfort. You do it too. I let out a small, highly unnatural, nervous laugh that sounded completely alien to my own ears. What in the world are you talking about? You act like everything in your life is perfectly fine, he said, his tone unwavering, stripping away any pretense. But it is not. I can tell. I felt something fundamental shift in the very air of the It was subtle, like the atmospheric pressure dropping right before a violent thunderstorm breaks. But it was absolutely unmistakable. That is not really something you need to be worrying your head about, I said. I tried desperately to keep my tone light, breezy, and dismissive, playing the role of the unbothered adult. I am not worried about it, he replied smoothly. I just noticed things. It was such an incredibly strange, disarming thing to hear, coming from someone his age. He was far too perceptive, far too direct, lacking the polite, societal filters that adults use to protect each other from uncomfortable truths. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, a deeply ingrained, defensive instinct kicking in to shield myself. Okay then, detective, I said, forcing a teasing lilt into my voice. What exactly do you think you have noticed about my life? He did not smile at the joke. He did not break eye contact. I think you are lonely, he said. The weight of those 5 simple words landed against my chest, so much harder than I could have ever anticipated. They stung, not because they were malicious or intended to be cruel, but because they were devastatingly, undeniably accurate. They cut straight through the facade I had spent months carefully constructing. I opened my mouth, fully intending to brush the comment off, to effortlessly turn his observation into a self-deprecating joke and change the subject. But my throat felt tight, and nothing came out. I just stared at him. Seeing my reaction, he looked down at the carpet, a flash of genuine regret washing over his features, as if he had suddenly realized he had stepped way over an invisible line. I am sorry, he muttered, his bravado instantly evaporating. I really didn't mean to upset you. It is fine. I cut in quickly, entirely too quickly. My voice sounded thin and reedy. The spacious living room suddenly felt claustrophobic, the walls pressing inward. Seriously, I added, forcing the corners of my mouth up into a rigid, entirely unconvincing smile. You really should go home. Your mom is probably wondering where you are. This time, he did not hesitate. He scrambled to his feet right away. Yeah, okay. He walked swiftly to the entryway, grabbed the brass handle of the front door, and then paused. He stood frozen for a long second, his back to me. I didn't mean it in a bad or mean way, he said softly, speaking to the wooden door without turning around. It is just, you seem like someone who shouldn't have to be lonely. And with that quietly devastating parting thought, he opened the door and disappeared into the night. I stood paralyzed in the center of the hallway. For a long time after the heavy door clicked shut, I stared blankly at the brass deadbolt, helplessly replaying his final words over and over again, in the echoing theater of my mind. You seem like someone who shouldn't be. It was such a heartbreakingly simple sentence, stripped of any adult complexity, but it stuck in my chest like a physical splinter. And that evening was the precise moment, whether my rational mind wanted to admit it or not, that everything fundamentally changed. It did not happen in a loud, dramatic, cinematic way. There was no explicit line officially crossed, no grand, sweeping event to point to. It was just a quiet, profound shift in the foundation. It was a hairline crack in a heavy sealed door that had been locked tightly shut for a very long time. And standing there in the cold hallway, I did not fully realize just how much that one single, vulnerable conversation was going to unravel everything I had built. The very next time he came over, I almost pretended I wasn't home. I stood in the darkened hallway, peering through the sheer curtain of the front window. I watched him standing on the porch, looking exactly as he always did, with that battered backpack hanging off one shoulder. He was nervously shifting his weight from one foot to the other, glancing over his shoulder toward his own house, clearly debating internally whether he should ring the bell again or just turn around and leave. For several agonizing seconds, I simply stood there in the shadows, paralyzed, remembering the exact cadence of his voice from our last encounter. "Faye, I think you are lonely." It absolutely shouldn't have mattered. He was a teenager. He was just a kid navigating his own messy life. What could he possibly know about the complexities of adult loneliness? And yet, his observation sat festering under my skin in a way I found impossible to shake off. It lingered not because it caused me pain, but because it felt like being truly, clearly seen for the first time in years. I hadn't even fully grasped how invisible I had allowed myself to become, until a 15-year-old boy pointed it out. He knocked again. The sound was much softer this time, almost hesitant. I took a deep breath, smoothed my shirt, and unlocked the door. "Hey," I said, forcing my tone to sound exceptionally casual, and "Hey," he replied, his eyes darting up to meet mine for a fraction of a second, before immediately locking onto the welcome mat. "Is this a bad time? Should I go?" I could have so easily said yes. I probably should have said yes. It would have been the clean, responsible adult thing to do. But instead, I stepped aside, repeating the same welcoming gesture I always did. "No, it is totally fine. Come on in." He stepped over the threshold, moving much more cautiously than he usually did, glancing around the familiar hallway as if he were trying to determine if the rules of the house had secretly changed while he was gone. And honestly, looking back, something had changed. I just lacked the vocabulary to accurately define what it was. We did not immediately dive into a pile of textbooks and highlighters this time. He walked into the kitchen, gently set his heavy bag down on the floor, but made no move to unzip it or pull out any binders. "Are you okay?" I asked, leaning against the marble counter, observing his tense posture. "Yeah," he replied, entirely too quickly. "Why? You just seem a lot quieter than usual," I noted. He offered a half-hearted shrug, rubbing the back of his neck. "I guess I am just really tired today." I nodded slowly, though I did not believe that excuse for a single second. But I decided not to push the issue, not yet. I turned around, poured myself a tall glass of ice water from the fridge, and leaned back against the counter, casually watching him out of the corner of my eye. On a normal day, by this point, he would already be peppering me with questions about a confusing reading assignment or loudly complaining about an unfair test grade. Today, he just stood there in the center of the kitchen, hands jammed deep in his pockets, as if he were waiting for a cue. Or perhaps he was actively building up the courage to say something specific. "Do you actually have anything you need help with tonight?" I asked after the silence stretched on a moment too long. He hesitated, his gaze drifting over the cabinets, before he slowly shook his head. "Not really." That admission should have been my immediate, undeniable cue to end the interaction right there. If there was no homework, there was no legitimate reason for him to stay. I was a neighbor, not a babysitter. "Then why exactly did you come over?" I asked, my voice dropping to a softer, gentler register. He finally looked directly at me, and there was something distinctly different in his expression. The awkward, fumbling teenage hesitation was gone. His eyes looked surprisingly intentional. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quiet but incredibly steady. "I just really didn't want to go back home yet." And there it was again, that terrifyingly subtle, almost imperceptible shift, the strict, defined line between adult neighbor and confidant blurring just a little bit more. "You know you can't just hang out here every single time you don't feel like dealing with your house," I said. I tried my hardest to keep the reprimand light and teasing, but a sharp edge of genuine warning bled through my tone. "I know," he said, his shoulders dropping defensively. I am not trying to, be weird or invade your space or anything. I didn't say you were being weird, I countered gently. He started, pulling one hand out of his pocket to run it through his messy hair in a gesture of pure frustration. It is just so much easier to be over here. Okay, that specific word. Phasier. Faye hit me right in the chest, in a way I completely failed to anticipate. It hit me because I understood exactly. My house was deeply quiet. It was entirely predictable. There was no thick, suffocating tension hanging in the air. There were no suddenly slammed doors echoing down the halls, no unpredictable, raised voices tearing through the evening peace. There was just vast, empty, undisturbed space. And apparently, that emotional vacuum was a space he desperately wanted to step into, to escape his own reality. Just because it is easier doesn't necessarily mean it is a good idea, I said, even though I could hear my own voice softening, betraying my strict words. He nodded slowly, looking at the floor again, as if he had already accepted that truth long before he knocked on my door. Yeah, I get it. A heavy, incredibly awkward pause settled over the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly sounded deafening. You can stay for a little while, I heard my own voice say, seemingly acting entirely independently of my rational brain. But you cannot stay too late tonight. I honestly do not know why I allowed those words to leave my mouth. Actually, that is a lie. I do know exactly why. I just did not want to admit it to myself at the time. I liked the company. He looked up, a small, genuine smile, finally breaking through his tense expression. Okay, thanks, Chloe. We completely abandoned the kitchen island, and ended up sitting in the living room instead. There were no textbooks scattered between us, no crumpled assignment sheets. I simply turned the television on to a random channel, keeping the volume low so it hummed in the background. Though neither of us was actually paying any attention to the screen. At some point, attempting to re-establish normal boundaries, I asked him a mundane question about his classes, and the conversation slowly started to flow again, settling into the familiar, comfortable rhythm we had established over the past few weeks. But despite the casual topics, the fundamental nature of the interaction felt completely different now. It no longer felt like a responsible adult tutoring a struggling student. It felt intensely like two isolated people simply sitting in a room, keeping the dark away by talking. And the terrifying reality was that this realization should have made me incredibly uncomfortable. I should have stood up and sent him home, but I didn't. I felt perfectly at ease. That was the core of the problem. Do you ever regret it? He asked, his voice suddenly cutting through the ambient noise of the television. I slowly turned my head toward him, my brow furrowing in genuine confusion. What? Regret what? Getting married, he said plainly, staring straight ahead at the television screen. The sheer audacity of the question caught me completely off guard. The breath hitched in my throat. That is a pretty massive, complicated question to ask someone. I deflected, trying to buy time. Yeah, he agreed easily, completely unfazed by my defensive tone. But do you? I let out a long, quiet breath, turning my gaze back to the glowing screen, watching the meaningless images flicker for several seconds before I finally answered. It really is not that simple. Ethan, that is not an actual answer, he pointed out softly. I shot a quick glance at him. You don't even like it when your own teachers use that excuse to avoid answering your questions, do you? A faint smirk played on the corner of his mouth. No, I don't. I hesitated, my fingers nervously twisting the fabric of my sweater. I don't regret the act of getting married, I said, choosing my words with agonizing care, I think. I regret how things eventually turned out. He did not respond right away, but I could physically feel the weight of his eyes watching the side of my face, analyzing my statement. Like what? He prodded gently. Like how people inevitably change, I said, my voice barely a whisper in the dim room. Or maybe they don't actually change at all. Maybe you just eventually start seeing them differently, once the initial illusion wears off. He nodded slowly, absorbing the philosophy of it. My dad changed, he offered, offering a piece of his own pain in return. Or at least, I think he did. How so? I asked, leaning slightly toward him. Well, he used to be around the house all the time. Like, he was at— And then, over the last few years, it was like he just completely checked out, mentally way before he ever physically packed a bag and left. That description sounded horribly, painfully familiar in a way that made my chest ache. And your mom? I asked, treading incredibly carefully. She tries, he said, his voice laced with a mixture of pity and resentment. But it is like she is always trapped somewhere else inside her own head. She is never really in the room with me. I look down at my hands, currently resting limply in my lap, suddenly feeling very cold. Yeah, I whispered into the quiet space. That happens to people. A long, heavy pause stretched out after that exchange. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, exactly. It was just dense. It was loaded with entirely too much mutual understanding. You and Julian don't really talk much, do you? He stated, rather than asked. My head snapped up, a flash of defensive anger finally sparking. Why in the world would you say something like that? He offered a non-committal shrug. But that same unwavering, unnervingly steady look remained locked in his eyes. I don't know. I just literally never see him around. He is a ghost, and on the rare days when I do see him pulling into the driveway, it is like you guys aren't really together. You just happen to be parking next to each other. That observation shouldn't have made me so fiercely defensive. I knew my marriage was a hollow shell, but hearing a teenager describe it so effortlessly stung. You really don't know anything about my marriage, I snapped, my voice coming out much sharper and colder than I intended. I didn't claim I did, he replied evenly, not backing down. Then please do not make grand assumptions about my life, I demanded. He held his hands up in a small gesture of surrender, physically leaning back slightly as if backing away from my anger. Okay, I am sorry. The spacious room went completely silent again. But this time, the texture of the quiet was different. It was brittle. It was incredibly tense. I exhaled a long, shaky breath, dragging a trembling hand through my hair. I am sorry, I said. After a grueling minute passed, that came out much harsher than I meant it to. It is fine, he said, but the warmth had completely drained from his tone. It was flat and cool. No, it really isn't fine, I insisted, feeling a surge of guilt. You just constantly catch me completely off guard with the things you say. He nodded, accepting the apology, but he remained silent. For a panicked second, I was certain that was going to be the absolute end of it. I thought he would stand up, grab his frayed bag, and walk out the door, and that perhaps that abrupt ending would be for the absolute best for everyone involved. But he didn't move. Instead, he leaned back against the sofa cushions, tilting his head slightly to stare up at the shadows playing on the ceiling. I really think that people, especially kids, can tell way more about a situation than adults. Assume they can, he said quietly, almost speaking to himself. I swallowed hard, a lump forming in my throat. Just because you notice things doesn't automatically mean your conclusions are right. Sometimes they are right, he countered softly. I did not have the energy or the conviction to argue with him about that, because the terrifying unspoken truth was that a huge part of me knew he was not entirely wrong about my life. And that was precisely what made sitting next to him so incredibly uncomfortable. We sat there on the sofa for a while longer, the tense atmosphere eventually dissipating as the conversation slowly drifted toward much safer, meaningless topics. We talked about newly released movies, tedious school drama, and random, Inconsequential things that carried absolutely no emotion. Eventually, I casually glanced over at the clock glowing on the mantel. "You really should head back now," I said, keeping my voice firm. "It is getting late again." "Yeah," he agreed immediately, sitting up straight. "Okay." He grabbed his canvas backpack from the floor, slinging it effortlessly over his shoulder, just like he always did. When he reached the heavy front door, he paused with his hand hovering over the brass knob. "Hey, Chloe," he said. "Yeah." He turned his head to look back at me, and for a fleeting, heartbreaking second, he looked incredibly young again. He looked exactly like the lost child who had knocked on my door weeks ago asking for help with an essay. "Thanks," he said, his voice earnest. "Thanks for letting me just hang out here." I offered him a small, tight smile that I hoped looked reassuring. "You are welcome, Ethan." He hesitated by the door, his eyes searching my face as if he desperately wanted to say something else, something heavier. "Good night." "Good night." I stood by the window and watched him walk slowly back across the dark, manicured lawn toward his own house, the motion sensor porch light flicking on with a harsh glare as he approached his steps. For a brief second, I clearly saw his mother's anxious silhouette pacing back and forth past her living room window. And then he opened the door and was swallowed up by his own home. I closed my blinds, leaned heavily against the cold wall, and exhaled a breath I felt like I had been holding for an hour. "This is not a big deal," I desperately whispered to the empty room. That is the rationalization I repeated to myself like a mantra. He was just a confused, lonely teenager, going through an incredibly rough time with his parents' messy divorce. I was simply being a compassionate neighbor, a responsible, listening adult offering a safe harbor. But something deep in my gut violently rejected that narrative. It did not feel that simple anymore. The complexity lived in the way he looked at me during those long silences. It was never overtly inappropriate, and he never crossed any explicitly forbidden lines, but his gaze was deeply aware. He was observant in a piercing way that made me feel entirely exposed, stripped of all my carefully constructed adult armor. And the danger lived in the way I responded to him. It was in the way I willingly let him stay far longer than any tutor should have. It was in the way I answered his deeply personal questions, when I absolutely should have deflected them. It was in the way I utterly failed to shut the dynamic down, when it started feeling significantly less like a neighborly favor and significantly more like something else. Something nameless, intoxicating, and incredibly risky. I pushed myself away from the wall and walked slowly back into the center of the living room. The silence of the house settled over my shoulders again, but it did not feel as peaceful and solitary as it used to. The silence felt heavy. It felt noticeable. It felt as though a vital piece of the room was suddenly missing, or perhaps like a dangerous chain reaction had silently started in the corner, and I simply did not fully understand the scope of it yet. Either way, I had this quiet, persistent, dreadful feeling thrumming in the back of my mind that things were rapidly shifting in a direction I was entirely unprepared to navigate, and I did absolutely nothing to stop it. That was the most terrifying part that I could not ignore. I saw the train coming, and I just stood on the tracks. Things did not spiral out of control all at once. That is the crucial part that outsiders never really understand, unless they have lived through the slow erosion of boundaries themselves. There was never some explosive, dramatic moment where everything suddenly crossed an unforgivable line in a single chaotic night. The descent was infinitely slower than that. It was quiet. It was built methodically out of hundreds of tiny, seemingly insignificant decisions that I continually convinced myself simply did not matter in the grand scheme of things. After that intense conversation about loneliness, Ethan began coming over much more regularly. But the visits stopped being about schoolwork almost entirely. Oh, occasionally he would bring a spiral notebook or a heavy textbook just to serve as a convenient prop. Just to make it look like there was a legitimate academic reason for him standing on my porch. But we both implicitly knew that was not why he was there. And the absolute worst part is that I allowed that deception to become our new accepted normal. It got to the point where I became so attuned to him that I could accurately predict what kind of day he had endured just by listening to the rhythm of his knock on the door. If the knocks were short, sharp, and quick, it meant he was in a rush, feeling practical, and probably actually needed help solving a math equation. But if the knocks were slower, softer, and uneven, it meant something in his world was severely off balance. Those were always the nights he stayed the longest. One unusually cold evening, perhaps a week or two after our discussion about my marriage, he showed up on the porch without even bothering to bring the prop. There was no frayed backpack slung over his shoulder. There were no textbooks clutched in his hands. It was just him, standing there in a faded gray hoodie, shivering slightly in the wind. I pulled the door open and immediately noticed his empty hands. "No massive homework emergencies today?" I asked, attempting a half-joking tone. But there was a very real, probing question hiding underneath the humor. He looked at me, his eyes dark and tired, and simply shook his head. That was the moment. That was exactly when I should have drawn the line in the sand. I should have looked him in the eye and asked, "Phaethon, why are you standing on my porch?" But I didn't say it. Instead, I stepped backward, opening the door wider. "Okay," I murmured, keeping my voice soft. "Come on in." He walked into my house not as a hesitant guest, but as if he fundamentally belonged there now. He did not hover awkwardly near the entryway rug. He did not wait for an invitation to take his shoes off. That profound shift in his comfort level alone should have been enough to make me pause and reevaluate everything. But instead, I simply turned, walked into the bright kitchen, and asked, "Do you want something to drink?" "Sure," he replied, his voice echoing from the living room as if this routine was the most normal, mundane thing in the entire world. I grabbed a cold soda from the fridge, carried it out to the living room, and handed it to him. We ended up settling into the exact same spots we always occupied, me on one end of the long sofa, him on the other. The same television was glowing quietly in the background, broadcasting a show neither of us cared about, but the energy pulsing between us in the room was entirely different tonight. It was thick. It was heavier. It was far too familiar. "What happened?" I asked, gently after a few minutes of listening to the fake laugh track on the television. He glanced over at me, his brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" I shifted on the cushions, turning my body fully toward him. "You didn't just walk over here empty, handed in the freezing cold for absolutely no reason. Something happened." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the aluminum can in his hands. He slowly leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on his knees. "My mom had some guy over at the house tonight." The confession hit the air fast and hard, sucking the oxygen out of the room. "Oh," I said, completely taken aback. "Yeah," he said, letting out a dry, bitter, humorless laugh that sounded far too cynical for a teenager. "First time I've ever actually seen a strange man sitting inside our house since my dad left." I honestly did not know what to say to that. There is absolutely no established social script for how to comfort the teenage son of your neighbor when his mother starts dating again. "How did that situation go?" I asked, choosing my words with extreme caution. He shrugged his shoulders, but the movement was tight, rigid, and completely controlled. "It went exactly how you think it went. It was awful." I studied his profile for a long second in the dim light. His jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle feathered in his cheek. His eyes remained fiercely fixed on the pattern of the rug. "Did you try talking to her about it after he left?" He shook his head violently, a flash of pure anger finally breaking through his controlled facade. Absolutely not. "I am not doing that." "Why not, Ethan?" "She needs to know how you feel. Because she will just instantly manipulate the conversation and turn it into something else. He spat, his voice rising in volume. She will act like I am the one with the problem for not being completely thrilled and supportive about some random stranger sitting in my living room. I sighed softly, my heart aching for the massive, confusing burden he was carrying. That is a really tough situation to navigate. She didn't even bother to warn me he was coming over. He added, his voice growing sharper, more jagged. I just walked downstairs to get a glass of water, and suddenly there is some guy I have never seen before, sitting on our couch, like he absolutely belongs there. I could practically feel the heat of the anger vibrating underneath his words. It was not explosive or violent, but it was simmering, boiling just below the surface. That can feel incredibly invasive, I offered, trying to validate his entirely justified feelings. Yeah, exactly, he said, finally turning his head to look directly at me. It feels like every single thing in my life is constantly changing, shifting beneath my feet, and absolutely no one ever stops to ask me if I am okay with it. I nodded slowly. I really do. He continued to hold my gaze for a second, far longer than was socially acceptable, as if he were actively searching for something specific hidden deep in my reaction. You really do get it, don't you? He said. It was not framed as a question, it was a statement of fact, and once again, I chose not to correct him. I did not remind him that I was an adult, and he was a child. We sat there together in that silent, shared understanding of what it feels like to be profoundly helpless in your own life. And something about that mutual recognition felt entirely too intimate, too closely aligned. Do you ever think about leaving? He asked suddenly, shattering the quiet. My stomach instantly tightened, plummeting toward the floor. Leaving what? Your husband? I let out a short, sharp breath that was almost a laugh, but it was completely devoid of any humor, Ethan. That is not something you can just casually ask someone you barely know. I noticed you didn't answer the question, he pointed out smoothly. I immediately looked away, forcing myself to stare intently at the glowing television screen, even though my brain was completely failing to process the images. It is complicated, I said, leaning back against the couch. Everything is always complicated to you, he countered. Excuse me, you always say that, he continued, his tone not aggressive, but merely pointing out an undeniable pattern. It is complicated. It is like your automatic default answer whenever you don't have the courage to say what you actually think. I turned my head and stared at him, feeling a chaotic mixture of genuine surprise, defensiveness, and something darker that I desperately did not want to name. You are entirely too observant for your own good, I said slowly, emphasizing every word. I told you that weeks ago, he replied without missing a beat. I notice things. Yeah, I muttered, dragging a hand down my tired face. I am certainly starting to see that. A pause settled between us, but surprisingly, it did not seem to make him uncomfortable in the slightest. If anything, he appeared significantly more settled and grounded in the silence than I was. I think you are deeply unhappy, he said, his voice quiet but echoing like a gunshot in the room. The sheer, unfiltered bluntness of the statement made my chest constrict painfully. You do not get to sit on my couch and diagnose my life. I shot back, my voice finally cracking like a whip. I am not trying to diagnose anything, he replied calmly, completely unruffled by my sudden anger. I am just saying out loud what it looks like from the outside. And what exactly gives you the right to do that? I demanded. He shrugged his shoulders slightly, looking at me with infuriating calm. Nothing gives me the right. I am just being honest with you. Just because you are being honest doesn't mean it is appropriate to say to me. Why not? He challenged, his brow furrowing. Because I am younger than you, yes, I said, my voice rising much sharper and louder than I intended. Yes, that is exactly why. He leaned back against the cushions, studying my flushed face in a way that made me feel completely transparent and exposed, like a bug pinned under a microscope. "I don't think my age automatically makes my observation wrong," he said quietly. I did not have a response to that. I pressed my lips together and remained silent, because again the terrifying part of my brain knew he wasn't entirely wrong, and confronting that reality was becoming exponentially harder to ignore. The heavy conversation eventually drifted after that confrontation, moving back to safer waters, but the underlying tension did not fully evaporate. It lingered beneath every sentence we spoke, humming like a live electrical wire, hidden just behind the walls. At some point, I glanced at the clock and realized with a shock how late the evening had gotten. "You really need to go," I said, keeping my voice much firmer and more authoritative this time. "Seriously, Ethan." Now he looked at the clock, then nodded slowly, though he made no immediate move to stand up. "You are kicking me out a lot earlier than you usually do," he noted. "It is not earlier," I corrected him swiftly. "This is a perfectly normal time for a teenager to go home on a weeknight." He gave me a long, sweeping look that explicitly communicated he did not believe a single word I was saying, but he did not push the issue. "Okay," he said finally, pushing himself up off the deep cushions. He grabbed his empty soda can, setting it carefully on the edge of the glass coffee table, and then scooped his gray hoodie off the floor. When he finally reached the front door, he stopped dead in his tracks again. "You know I am not intentionally trying to make things weird between us, right?" he said, his hand resting on the doorframe, speaking without turning around to face me. I hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I know, I just really like talking to you," he confessed softly. That simple, earnest admission absolutely should not have landed in my chest the way that it did. But it did. It felt warm, and that warmth terrified me. "You shouldn't be relying on me for that kind of emotional support, Ethan," I said, forcing my voice to remain perfectly steady, playing the role of the boundary-setting adult. "I am not. Not what?" I cut in sharply, my anxiety finally getting the better of me. He turned slowly to face me, his expression a mix of confusion and hurt. "I am not your friend," I said finally, the words rushing out in a breathless panic, the absolute second the sentence left my mouth. I instantly knew how incredibly wrong it sounded. It was entirely too defensive. It sounded like a guilty confession. He blinked rapidly, clearly caught completely off guard by the venom in my tone. "I never said you were my friend," he replied, slowly, carefully. "I know, but what?" I shook my head violently, feeling a profound sense of frustration washing over me. "This whole situation is it is not at all what it is supposed to be." "And what exactly is it supposed to be?" he challenged softly. "It is supposed to be you coming over here to get help with your schoolwork. Not this. Not analyzing my marriage and hiding from your mother." He was dead quiet for a long, agonizing second, simply staring at me. Then he nodded his head very slowly. "Okay," he said, his voice chillingly devoid of emotion. "So you are saying you want me to stop coming over?" That single question hung suspended in the air between us, feeling infinitely heavier than it ever should have been, because the answer to that question should have been incredibly easy. The answer should have been an immediate, unequivocal, "Yes, Fayez, stop coming over. Yes, this has gone too far." Asterisk, that is what a responsible adult would have said. But I didn't say it. "I think we just need to do a much better job of setting clear boundaries," I said instead, compromising the truth. Even as the pathetic, corporate speak words fell out of my mouth, I felt sick at how weak and cowardly it sounded. He watched my face intently for another second, reading right through the lie, then gave a very small, barely perceptible nod. "Got it." But there was something deeply cynical in his tone, a dark knowingness that explicitly told me he did not actually believe anything between us was going to change. And the absolute worst part, he was entirely right. "Good night, Ethan." He walked out into the cold, and I was left standing there once again, isolated in that same quiet, echoing house, feeling like a driver who had just willfully sped past the absolute last exit on the highway. Faye set better boundaries. It sounded so responsible in theory. It sounded like an adult-controlled action plan. But it was not an action. It was pure, cowardly avoidance. And over the course of the next few days, that reality became painfully, undeniably clear, because absolutely nothing changed. If anything, the dynamic between us pulled even closer. He still came over on the exact same schedule. He still consistently stayed far longer than he had any right to. He still asked incredibly probing, personal questions that bypassed every normal social boundary. And I kept answering them, that was me, that was my choice. I was actively allowing it to mutate into something it was never ever supposed to be. The ultimate moment when everything truly, irreversibly shifted did not happen in some grand, explosive confrontation. It happened on an otherwise remarkably quiet Friday night. Julian was actually home for once. But as usual, he was not really fait-present Faye. He had arrived back from the airport incredibly late, dragged his suitcase through the hall, barely murmured 2 exhausted words in my direction, and immediately disappeared into the master bedroom with his glowing laptop, claiming he had just a few final urgent emails to fire off before he could unwind. I did not argue with him. I did not ask questions about his trip. I did not ask how he was feeling. I just stood in the kitchen and let him go. Around 8:30, a familiar sound broke the silence. A soft knock at the front door. My stomach completely dropped toward my knees before I even looked out the window. I already knew exactly who it was. I practically sprinted to the entryway, pulling the heavy door open just enough to allow myself to slip outside, quickly pulling it shut behind my back, so we were standing together in the cold night air on the porch. "What in the world are you doing here?" I hissed quietly, frantically looking around the dark neighborhood. He looked taken aback, his brow furrowing in confusion. "I always come over on Fridays." "My husband is home," I whispered urgently, my heart hammering against my ribs. He stared at me, his face blank. So that one single nonchalant word made something sharp and painful twist violently in my chest. "So this is a really bad time," I said, struggling to keep my voice low and steady. He studied my panicked face for a long second in the yellow porch light, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed my reaction. Then he nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, his voice flat. "I can go back home." He turned his body away from me, preparing to walk down the steps, and it was clear he meant it. He was leaving. And something broken and irrational inside of me reacted before my logical brain could intervene to stop it. Wait. He immediately stopped on the top step, his back still facing me. I honestly do not know why that word escaped my lips. Maybe it was because of the crushing, suffocating silence waiting for me inside the house. Maybe it was because of the humiliating reality that Julian had not even noticed I had walked out of the room. Maybe it was simply because Ethan actually saw me. I slowly pushed the front door open, leaving a small crack. "Just for a little while," I whispered into the dark. He turned around to look at me, and there was something new written across his expression that I had never seen before. It was not teenage confusion. It was not awkward hesitation. It was something much darker, much more certain. And that is exactly when I realized, entirely too late, that whatever this tangled mess had transformed into, he understood the reality of it far better than I did. And I was the one who had willingly held the door open and let it get to this point. I knew the absolute second I uttered the words "Faye, just for a little while, Faye," that I had already stepped over a line that I could never, ever uncross. Not in a physical sense. Not in the illicit, explicitly scandalous way people immediately jump to when they hear hushed rumors about these types of stories. But I had crossed it mentally. I had crossed it emotionally. That fragile boundary line, the one I kept desperately pretending I was actively managing and maintaining, was completely eradicated. And the most devastating part of the entire ordeal was that I was acutely aware of the boundary dissolving while it was happening, and I still chose not to stop it. Ethan stepped silently inside the house, moving with an exaggerated caution, intuitively understanding that tonight was fundamentally different from every other time he had visited. The entire atmosphere of the house felt radically different with Julian occupying the room down the hall. The air was physically tighter, thicker, as if the very plaster walls were holding their breath and listening to us. "Keep your voice down," I instructed automatically, carefully easing the heavy front door shut until it clicked softly into the frame. He nodded silently, his eyes instantly darting toward the dark hallway that led directly to the master bedroom. "He is in there," he mouthed. "Yeah," I whispered back. "Does he know that I come over here?" I hesitated. The pause lasted just a fraction of a second too long, but it was enough to answer the question for him. "Not really," I admitted softly. He did not react the way a normal teenager would. There was no wide-eyed surprise, no nervous awkwardness. He merely gave a very small, deliberate nod, as if he were carefully filing that crucial piece of information away in a mental folder. We bypassed the kitchen entirely and moved silently into the living room. I kept the main lights switched off, relying only on the dim glow of a corner lamp and the muted, flickering light of the television. The volume was turned down so low it was essentially a visual hum, and neither of us was paying the slightest bit of attention to the images on the screen. I sat rigidly on the edge of the sofa. I could physically feel the thudding rhythm of my own heartbeat. It felt louder than any other sound in the room, thumping erratically against my ribs. "This feels really different," he whispered, leaning slightly toward me on the cushions. "It is different," I replied, my hands gripping the fabric of my jeans. "Because he is here?" he asked, tilting his head toward the hallway. "Because it absolutely should not be happening like this," I said, trying to force a sense of authority into my hushed tone. He looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable in the dim light. "Then why is it happening?" I did not have a clean, logical answer for that question. There wasn't one to give. "Because I made a very bad judgment call," I finally whispered, staring at my white knuckles. "And I am trying incredibly hard right now not to make it worse." He held my gaze for a long, agonizing second, before slowly leaning back against the plush backrest of the couch. "You always say stuff like that," he observed quietly. "Like what?" "Like everything in your life is already permanently decided. Like you don't actually have any choice in what happens to you." I let out a shaky, quiet breath that sounded entirely too much, like a sob. "I do have a choice, Ethan. That is exactly the point." "Then choose," he said simply. The way he delivered those two words, so incredibly direct, so devoid of adult complexity and fear, made something deep inside my chest twist violently. "You think it is that easy?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I think you intentionally make it much harder than it actually is," he countered smoothly. I shook my head back and forth, almost talking to myself. "You don't understand the reality of this?" "Then explain it to me," he challenged. I looked at him then. I really looked at him, studying the planes of his face in the flickering light, and for a terrifying second, I saw two entirely different versions of him overlapping. I saw the vulnerable lost kid he was, and I simultaneously saw the complicated, perceptive person he was rapidly becoming. And that exact intersection, that overlap, was where the dynamic felt the most incredibly dangerous. "It is not just about what I want," I whispered fiercely. "There are massive consequences. There are firm lines that you simply do not cross. because once you finally step over them, you can never pretend you didn't. Like what we are doing right now, he asked, his voice steady. The question landed between us, clean, sharp, and undeniable. There was no background noise from the street, no distracting hum from the refrigerator. There was absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of that single word, sitting heavy on the sofa between us. So stop, he challenged softly. It should have been exactly that simple. Stand up, walk to the door, say goodbye. Yeah, I whispered into the dark. I should, but my body refused. My legs felt like lead, and he didn't move an inch either. Another long beat of silence passed, stretching out, feeling infinitely heavier and more dangerous than the last. You don't actually want to stop, he stated. It wasn't framed as a hostile accusation. It was simply an objective observation of fact. I swallowed hard, the dry lump in my throat feeling like a stone. I felt the undeniable truth of his words pressing brutally against all the polite lies and excuses I had been using to hold my fractured life together. It is not about what I want to do, I argued weakly. It is about doing what is right, and to you those two things are always exactly the same, he asked, raising an eyebrow. No, I finally admitted, feeling a tear prick the corner of my eye. No, they are not. He leaned forward slowly, resting his forearms deliberately on his knees, closing the physical distance between us. He was sitting much closer to me now, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, but he was not touching me. Then what do you actually want, Chloe? He asked, his voice a low murmur. That question paralyzed me. No one had asked me what I genuinely wanted in a very, very long time. Not Julian, not my friends, not anyone. And I realized, sitting frozen on the edge of that couch in the dim, flickering light of the living room, that I did not possess a clear answer anymore. I had buried my own desires so deep I couldn't find them. I just want things to feel normal again, I finally whispered, the words sounding hollow. Things were not normal before, he replied immediately, cutting through the delusion. I let out a small, miserable, humorless laugh that caught in my throat. You are right. They weren't. Then why on earth would you want to go back to that? Because it is safe, I said, a tear finally spilling over my lashes. Because it is the life I chose to build. And you are happy with it. I did not answer him. I couldn't. Because the agonizing silence that filled the room answered the question far more eloquently than any words I could have possibly forced past my lips. We sat completely motionless like that for several minutes. Neither of us moved a muscle. Both of us were now painfully, fully aware of exactly how far this entire situation had drifted from a neighbor helping a kid with a homework assignment. Then, cutting through the silence from deep down the dark hallway, I heard a sound, a heavy door shifting on its hinges, the distinct creak of weight settling onto hardwood floorboards. My entire body instantly went rigid, paralyzed by a spike of pure adrenaline. Ethan heard the sound too. I could see the sudden shift in his posture, the way his spine snapped straight, his sharp attention immediately snapping toward the dark corridor. Is that? He started to ask, his voice tight. Shh! I hissed frantically, my eyes wide with panic. Footsteps, they were slow, they were measured, and they were steadily getting closer to the living room. And then Julian appeared in the arched doorway. For a terrible, endless second, absolutely no one in the room spoke. Julian simply stood there under the archway, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, silently taking in the bizarre scene unfolding in his house. Me, sitting stiffly on one end of the long couch, Ethan sitting entirely too close on the other end. The muted television casting a soft blue, flickering shadow across both of our guilty faces. Hey, Julian said. His voice was calm. It was entirely, terrifyingly too calm. What exactly is going on out here? My panicked brain violently scrambled to catch up, desperately trying to piece together a coherent explanation that sounded remotely normal. "This is Ethan," I said, the words rushing out of my mouth far too quickly. "He lives next door. I've been helping him with some school stuff lately." Julian's eyes slowly shifted away from my face and locked onto the teenager. He studied Ethan from head to toe in a slow, analytical way that made my stomach drop into a bottomless pit. "At night?" Julian asked, his voice remaining low and steady in the dark. "It is just, sometimes late at night is the only time he needs the help," I stammered, the excuse sounding pathetic and flimsy even to my own ears. Ethan did not say a single word. He did not attempt to defend himself or corroborate my story. He simply sat there, his jaw locked, watching Julian with cold, assessing eyes, which, somehow, made the entire scene look infinitely worse. Julian slowly turned his gaze back to me, his eyes narrowing. "How long exactly has this been happening?" "Not long," I lied instinctively. "Just a few weeks." "That is not what I asked you, Chloe." I swallowed hard, feeling physically nauseous. Julian let out a very slow, measured breath, nodding his head slightly, as if he were carefully processing the data of a complex business merger. "And you didn't ever think it might be worth mentioning to me? It really didn't feel like a big deal," I pleaded, even though both of us in the room explicitly knew that was no longer true. Another agonizingly long pause stretched between. Then, Julian looked past me at the teenager again. "Hey man," Julian said, his tone shifting just slightly, adopting the authoritative cadence of an adult speaking to a child. "Why don't you pack it up and head home for the night?" Ethan hesitated. It was just for a fraction of a second, but it was noticeable. He looked at me, then back at Julian. Then he gave a short, curt nod. "Yeah, okay." He stood up slowly, grabbed his gray hoodie off the carpet, and began walking toward the entryway. As he walked past the sofa, he did not look at me. He did not turn his head even for a split second. That deliberate lack of acknowledgement hit me harder than a physical blow. The heavy front door opened, letting in a blast of freezing air, and then clicked firmly shut. And then, it was just me and Julian. The silence left in the wake of the door closing stretched out, feeling incredibly thick, toxic, and suffocating. I sat frozen on the sofa, terrified to move. Finally, Julian spoke, his voice dangerously soft. "That kid just called you by your first name when he left." My heart completely stopped beating in my chest, because in my blind panic, I hadn't even registered it. But now that Julian had pointed it out, the audio played back in my head as clear and distinct as a ringing bell. "Fay goodnight, Chloe **. He hadn't said Mrs. Carter. He hadn't used any polite, appropriate honorific. Just Chloe. I guess I didn't correct him," I whispered weakly, my hands shaking. Julian let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. There was absolutely zero humor in the sound. "No, Chloe, you certainly did not." He took 2 slow steps further into the living room, shaking his head slightly, as if trying to clear a disturbing image from his mind. "What exactly is going on in this house while I am gone?" "Nothing," I yelled, the word exploding out of me entirely too fast. "I swear to you, it is not." "What exactly is it like?" I opened my mouth to explain, to rationalize, to defend myself, but the words simply would not come together in any configuration that sounded remotely believable, because the terrifying truth was incredibly messy. It was not a physical affair, but it certainly was not innocent. It lived somewhere in a dark, murky, undefined space in between. It was an emotional transgression that lacked a clean, easily dismissible label. "I don't know," I finally admitted, the tears finally breaking and spilling hot down my cheeks. That honest admission seemed to frustrate Julian more than any lie could have. "You don't know," he repeated, his voice finally rising, echoing off the high ceilings. You have been spending hours alone, late at night, in the dark, with a teenage boy. And you don't know what it is." When he synthesized the facts and said them out loud like that, the reality of the situation sounded infinitely worse, infinitely more depraved than I had ever allowed myself to believe. I didn't plan any of this, I sobbed, wrapping my arms around my own torso. It just started happening. "I know," I wept quietly, staring at the floor. "I know it isn't." He stood above me and stared down at my shaking form for a very long moment, as if he were trying to decide exactly what to do with the wreckage he had just walked into, with absolutely everything that is currently going on between us, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. "With the state of our marriage, this is what you actively chose to fill the gap with." That question cut deeper than any screaming accusation ever could have. It bypassed the anger and struck directly at the pathetic foundational truth of the matter. Because he was not wrong, I honestly didn't think of it like that. I whispered through my tears, "But that is exactly what it is, isn't it?" I did not argue with him. I couldn't. I had no defense left. The spacious living room suddenly felt impossibly small, crushing inward, as the reality of what I had done finally collapsed on top of me. "I am going to ask you this one single time," Julian said, his tone icy and uncompromising, "and I need you to look me in the eye and be completely, brutally honest with me." I nodded frantically, barely able to draw breath into my lungs. "Has anything physical happened between you and that boy that shouldn't have?" "No," I practically screamed, the force of the denial tearing from my throat immediately. I swear to God, Julian, nothing like that, never." That specific part was the absolute truth. But the absence of physical contact did not mean everything was okay. The emotional betrayal was already sitting heavy in the room. Julian held my tear-streaked gaze for a long time, actively searching for the lie. He was looking for doubt, or perhaps seeking confirmation of his worst fear. After an excruciating minute, he slowly nodded his head. "Okay," he said, his voice entirely hollow. "Then this stops, immediately." There was absolutely no room for negotiation or debate in his tone. It already should have stopped a long time ago. He added softly, almost as an afterthought. "I know," I sobbed, burying my face in my hand, and for the very first time that entire night, for the first time in weeks, I actually meant it without instantly trying to soften the blow or rationalize my behavior. Because sitting there, hearing the reality of my actions spoken out loud, seeing the situation entirely through the horrified eyes of my husband, it completely stripped away all the comforting, pathetic justifications I had been hiding behind. It was never harmless. It was never just about helping a struggling kid with his homework. It was a dangerous, selfish dynamic that I actively allowed to go much too far simply because it temporarily made me feel slightly less isolated and invisible in my own life. And that profound selfishness came with massive, destructive consequences, whether I was finally ready to admit it to myself or not. Julian turned his back on me, dragging a heavy hand through his hair in a gesture of pure exhaustion. "I don't even know what I am supposed to do with this right now," he muttered to the empty room. But I knew one thing with absolute terrifying certainty as I sat weeping on the couch. The sanitized, comfortable version of this story that I had been telling myself for weeks, the harmless version, the strictly controlled version, was permanently dead and gone. And in its place was something significantly darker, uglier, and infinitely harder to ignore. It was a reality I was going to have to face in the cold light of day, whether I felt ready for the fallout or not, because the situation did not magically end. The second Ethan walked out that front door, that was merely the exact moment that everything I had been hiding from finally became real, and there was absolutely no going back to pretending I couldn't see the wreckage anymore.